beer. Here at Carpe's Corner, we'll learn about our lives. And in between, you might decide to exercise your eyes. Welcome to Carpe's Corner, so happy that you're here. So take a seat, have a tea, or grab yourself a beer. Here at Carpe's Corner, we'll learn about our lives. And in between, you might decide to exercise your rights. It's Carpe's Corner. Carpe's Corner, don't forget reviews. Comment, like, and subscribe is all you gotta do. Here at Carpe's Corner, please appreciate our guests. And just remember, everyone's got something on their chest. In Carpe's Corner.
Hello everybody. Welcome to Carpe's Corner. This is me, CarpeDonktum. Every single time I have to say, hopefully there's no microphone issues today. But today my guest is Dinesh D'Souza, and he's got a new book coming out, so I'm going to bring him on here, and we can see him. Hi, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. So I hear that you've got a book coming out. What is that book, and what is it about?
The book is called United States of Socialism, and I started writing it, probably a little over a year ago now. The reason I did was I had thought, I came to America as an immigrant in 1978. I lived through the collapse of the Berlin Wall. I saw not only the Soviet Empire collapse, but I saw India and China moving away from socialism toward free markets. So it looked like socialism was, as Reagan put it, on the ash heap of history, done, buried. And then in the 21st century, incredibly, it came back. And for the first time, it's kind of injected itself like a virus into the mainstream of American political debate. And I saw the way in which the pernicious influence of the squad, Bernie Sanders, is creeping into the mainstream of the left, the Democratic Party. And so that's what the book is about. It looks at why now? Is the socialism we're dealing with the same as we've dealt with before, or is it different? If it's different, how do we respond to this new socialism, and can we defeat it?
Right, and I think what's always sort of weird is how the Democratic Party really doesn't want to accept the squad so much, but they're sort of being forced by their base or parts of their base. I always think it's sort of a weird dynamic to watch. Nancy Pelosi, like, oh no, we're not really going to do that. And then 3 weeks later, the base has come in and said, no, Nancy, you have to do this. And because I think she knows that it's a bad idea. I think she knows that in the end, it's not going to work out in their favor, but she still has to at least play that role and cater to some of that base.
Well, the base is not really, I don't think, a base so much of voters as it is a base of activist organizations. Right. It is the media. It is Hollywood. So the big megaphones, the most influential cultural institutions of the left, this is what puts the pressure on. And I think for Nancy, she realizes, Nancy Pelosi does, and others in the Democratic leadership, that socialism is bad marketing. It doesn't look good if you're trying to win over mainstream voters. So you've got to camouflage the look of it. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but you should make it seem like you're not doing it. And I think this is really why the Democratic establishment ganged up on Bernie, and they basically said, "We like your ideas, but we got to throw you off the bus."
Yeah, you're saying things and you're not camouflaging enough. You're not hiding in the background enough. You're being too overt with, I'm a socialist and I want to do socialist things.
Exactly. And they also know that Bernie goes for cheap. I mean, basically his price is a beach house. So one more beach house and he's happy to get off the ticket and play the servile role of, introducing Joe Biden. So, I think Bernie's a bad capitalist. He could actually raise his price. But he's going cheap, and I can sort of understand it. Most of his career, he's been a bum. I mean, they threw him out of a socialist commune in the 70s because he wouldn't refuse to work. So I think I
read that first I believe that was in the introduction, or it was in one of the first chapters there. You actually highlighted a lot of stuff that I didn't even know about him. Often people assume that, if they're in Congress, they probably had a great career and all that kind of stuff. But you described just a complete bum for most of his life.
Yeah, I think until he was 40 years old, he would write articles in Marxist websites, but he never really had a job. He would move in with his friends. He'd sleep on the couch. Half the time they were getting their cable by ripping off their neighbor by connecting to his plug. And so, this is Bernie. I mean, I think Chris Matthews, in a kind of confessional moment on MSNBC, said, this is the kind of guy we'd see at the McGovern rally. He was the kook who's always shouting at the Xerox machine. And, they can't believe that this dude, this crazy, angry old man, is now suddenly a contender for the Democratic nomination.
Yeah, I believe that's what I called him in a meme, was a angry, bitter old man, because that's really just what he comes off as, is he's the guy that's yelling at everybody that they're not accepting his views enough, and that if they would only listen to him, socialism will work this time.
Yeah, I think of him as a kind of a Rip Van Winkle, the guy who went to sleep for 30 years and has woken up and he can't believe there's, cell phones and Airbnb and Uber, and he has that kind of dazed look on his face. The other thing is he's an unreconstructed old style socialist. I mean, look, even though the left says today, we want to be more like Scandinavia. We don't really want to be like Mao's China or Stalin's Russia. I mean, where did Bernie go for his honeymoon? Stockholm? No, he went to Moscow.
Right. Yeah. So something that you do talk about in the book, and we'll get to some other pressing topics here shortly, but something you do talk about is what you call identity socialism, and what would you define that as?
Well, identity socialism is what we see right now with the riots going on in Minnesota and other places, which is to say that we see socialism that is now kind of married to identity politics. The old socialism was just about class. It was about dividing the world into the workers and the exploiters. And Marx thought that the workers would become so angry and so discontented that they would revolt. They would burn the cities down. But that never happened. It never happened in Marx's day, and it hasn't happened to this day anywhere in the world. So the left, the smart guys on the left, realize that's not going to happen. If you want to find a proletarian guy today, a working class guy, you have to kind of go to the Trump rally. You can't count on that proletariat. We have to find new proletariat. And so this is when they began to say, well, how about if we try the blacks? I mean, you got genuine racial grievance. How about if we stoke that? What about gender? What about sexual orientation? What about immigration? So the left has created this kind of multiple lines of division. They try to polarize society, not just in one way, but in 8 different ways. And their goal, of course, is to create a coalition of discontented victim groups. So what they're doing right now, at the root of it, there's genuine historical grievance. There's obviously a genuine atrocity here, the way that this guy was treated, George Floyd. But what you also have is an attempt to create a remedy that has nothing to do with the original problem. How do you help it? By burning Target, burning AutoZone, burning minority businesses, and it doesn't work. But that is the agenda of the left. They want to stoke the grievance for political purposes, kind of the same way they tried to use the coronavirus for political purposes to wreck the Trump economy.
Yeah, I think everybody is watching what's going on in Minneapolis and is just shaking their head, because there have been so many cases where it's been such a split decision on was this really a case of brutality, or was this a case of something we didn't understand, or but this was one of those cases where everybody sort of agrees that this was really, we don't know what exactly happened, but it was really bad, whatever it was. And this was an opportunity, I think, where people could have come together on this issue. But now we've got this riot, and they took over a police station last night. The mayor of Minneapolis just abandoned the police station and gave it to the rioters. The chaos that they really want to sow throughout all of America, just because they hate Trump so much, it's mind-boggling how they can justify these things.
Well, it's a strategy on their part. It's the Antifa strategy for sure. And it's based on the old idea that you can use resentment and fear. Look, once again, coming back to Marx for a moment, Marx did not see himself as a social activist. He didn't think he needed to organize the workers. He thought that capitalism would create enough immiseration, poverty, and anger by itself, that it would happen automatically. And this is really why Marx thought he was being a scientific socialist. He was predicting something that would happen without any action on anybody's part, including his. But what the left does today is they very actively sow division, and they actively exploit fear. So the most significant progressive left advances in this country have always come on the heels of some panic. Even FDR. FDR used the Depression to the hilt to do things like impose marginal tax rates over 90%. He wanted 100% tax rates, by the way, at a certain bracket. FDR did. And then continuing in the 70s, the left tried, the world is running out of food. In the 80s, nuclear winter. In the 90s, the ozone layer. The last 20 years, it's been climate change.
Right.
So they go from it's a revolving placard of panicky situations, all intended to get us to cast aside our reason and do stupid stuff that we would never do in a rational moment.
And giving up freedoms, and giving up allowing the government to say everybody needs to stay inside. This is not, you'll be arrested if you're on a playground. You'll be arrested if you're doing this. You can't open up your business. You can't run your business. All of these things that happened like during the coronavirus thing, which I think pretty much everybody's done with that. I haven't seen a lot of people wearing masks unless they're actually rioting. But the left has taken full advantage of every time that we are willing to let them say, oh, just for the sake of caution, let's all stay inside. That's fine. We can stay in for 2 weeks, and then it becomes 2 months. And in the process, that now they're saying that vaccines and things like that we will never be safe until there is a vaccine for this coronavirus. What's the next step here?
Well, first of all, I'm still chuckling today over the mayor of Minneapolis essentially telling the rioters, hey guys, I don't mind the rioting. I just think it's really important for you guys to wear masks and social distance and do some social distancing. It kind of reminds me of a joke from the 1980s where one of my colleagues of the American Enterprise Institute was basically saying that if you're a liberal, you're going to be saying to your daughter, hey, listen, I don't mind the fact that you've become a prostitute, but I just want to make sure that they're paying you the minimum wage. So that you're dealing with the pathological left when you hear this kind of madness. But yeah, I think what's been to me very eye-opening about the coronavirus business was the way in which we saw not only the effort to create economic socialism, which is to say shortages, empty shelves, limits on purchases, the kind of thing I was experiencing in India when our family had a ration card. You could only buy so much cooking oil and so much rice and so on. But also the attack on civil liberties. I didn't see that coming to the degree it did. The surveillance, the drones, the idea that we attacks on religious freedom of assembly. Now, remarkably, although the left talks about democratic socialism, it's important to realize that our rights, our basic civil liberties and the Bill of Rights are not up for democratic referendum. It doesn't matter if 95% of people think I shouldn't say this. I have the right to say it. It doesn't matter if everybody else says that you can't practice your faith or have freedom of conscience. You have that right. It's immune from the democratic majority, but we seem to have sort of forgotten these lessons, and the glee with which the democratic left pushes these measures shows that they ultimately want to move away from the Constitution and not toward it.
Yeah, I can't imagine that there's anybody that was up on the stage during the Democratic debates that really thinks that the Constitution was even a good idea. Most of them, at least from all outward appearances, would like to curtail it as much as possible. And especially the Bill of Rights, first, second, fourth, all of those amendments there, they really don't mean anything to the left, or at least to the progressive left. I think there are still a few, classic liberals out there that might protect it, but I'm at my own personal experience. I'm seeing people on my Facebook, friends that I went to high school with, who are just eager to accept, don't go outside. If you do go outside, you have to wear a mask. If you don't wear a mask, you're a jerk. And if you tell them that this is an attack on liberty, they laugh at you. This is a ridiculous thing to them.
Well, I think the striking thing here is the way in which the principles that we sort of took for granted as being off the table. Off the table means accepted by everybody. Take a simple principle like free speech.
Right.
Who can argue that in a democratic society, we need that it's not a good idea to have a wide diversity of viewpoints, that you should be able to speak your mind, that you should be able to say whatever you want in the political sphere, and that short of an actual incitement to violence, anything should go. That's a basic civil libertarian position that I thought was shared pretty widely across the political spectrum. But now when you see, you listen to these third-rate schmucks on, who have been appointed by Twitter and Facebook to be the sort of police of discourse. I mean, to listen to these morons, you get the sense that they've never heard of John Stuart Mill, they've never read Orwell, and our fate in the public sphere is dependent upon these half-educated quacks who think that they're subordinate to some public interest, when the real public interest is served by taking these schmucks and locking them up in a room and turning out the lights and letting the rest of us speak our minds.
Right. Well, and I think a lot of them have read Orwell. They just used it as a roadmap instead of as a cautionary tale. So, I mean, as we're talking about these companies, the social media, last night, they again censored the president on Twitter and marked one of his tweets as some sort of glorification of violence, which I don't know if you've been on Twitter the last few days, but there's been a lot of glorifications of violence that didn't come from the president. And the thing is always that we're trying to police the health of the conversation, not the. It's never we don't like what's being said. It's always, I just don't think this is a healthy conversation we're having.
Well, you just got to remember, though, this is a kind of a very chilling historical echo. I mean, let's think about this. Between in the 20th century, for almost the first 2/3 of it, you had little seedy characters in places like Romania, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria. And most of these guys they would sit in little dark rooms and read books. And they would just decide, this book has got to go. This book should be burned. This book should not be published. These were the censors. And these schmucks at Twitter and YouTube and so on are their descendants. They're the descendants of these apparatchiks. Remember, not only is the action the same, which is censoring the public square, but the rationale is the same, which is we're serving the public interest. We think that this book is unhealthy for people to read. And so the same justification, Orwell, who was a man of the left, by the way, Orwell recognized, I think, later in life that he was always initially trying to salvage some form of socialism that would be okay. And I think he realized at the end that all forms of socialism lead to tyranny. Orwell's unforgettable image, a boot stamping on a human face.
Right.
And that's what these people ultimately are all about.
Well, and I think it's a very valid point that there is no socialism that doesn't lead to tyranny. It's the nature of what socialism is that leads to tyranny. When you take away my autonomy and my ability to do what I want with my life in the way that I want to do it, that's immediately right there is tyranny. It boils everything down to it. That when you make me do something for someone else, and it's not my choice, then tyranny starts right there, and it only gets worse.
I think this requires a moment of explanation because it's not obvious. The left today will say, well, listen, we don't believe in the authoritarian socialism of the bad old days. We want democratic socialism. And so if we're going to take your money, my friend, we're going to do it democratically. A majority of people are going to vote for it. Now, we have to pause for a moment to see why that itself is tyrannical. And that there's no fundamental difference between an autocrat saying, hey, listen, turn over half your money, and an elected majority doing exactly the same thing. It's almost like if you go to school with 10 marbles, and one guy jumps you and takes your marbles, okay, that's theft. Well, what if a bunch of guys, a majority jumps you and takes your marbles? That's also theft. The difference is sort of like the difference between individual rape and gang rape. The difference is only whether it's one guy doing it or a bunch of guys doing it. Either way, you're being robbed. Right. So that's the key point, that the left always begins with the appeal to democracy, as if to say, hey, gee, you know what, guys, we're just turning over these institutions to the people. Elizabeth Warren, we're going to turn over healthcare to the people. Oh, really? Well, what say does the average British guy have over the British National Health Service? None. What say do you or I have over the post office or the DMV? None. So this whole pretense of turning it over to us, the people, is complete charade and a disguise for them to actually put their thumb or their knee on our necks.
Well, and it's shirking of their responsibility for any of the outcomes too. It's in the people's hands. It's not just it's not me making these bad decisions. You guys wanted this. This is what you wanted, and in the end, the blame is always on the person that's being persecuted.
Yeah, and then these institutions also, these governmental institutions are just notorious for how deadening they are. You just have to step into them and your spirits begin to sag. Not to mention the
Right.
fact that these institutions never have an original idea, and years, decades, and even centuries can go by. I'm sure if it hadn't been for UPS and FedEx, the post office would still have not thought of overnight mail. If the government was in the luggage business, we would not have roll-on luggage.
Yeah, I thought that was funny. You were talking about all of the things that when you came from India, all of the things that you saw just around in America that were so normal that you were just like, oh my gosh, like who thought of roll-on luggage with putting wheels on luggage, and there's so much that Americans, I think, take for granted about the country we live in, that we're born with all of this. We're born with all of this privilege. The left likes to talk about privilege, but being an American is a privilege, and I think a lot of people don't remember that.
I think that what distinguishes one of the characteristics of my writing in general has been the fact that I grew up in a different culture. And so I'm bringing a perspective to America that is, in a way, a dual perspective. It's an insider perspective. I've obviously lived here since I was 17 years old, but it also has an element of an outsider perspective. And the reason this is relevant is when you talk, for example, about American history, you talk to the typical student today, and they get the idea that American history is defined by sort of three events. There was a revolution, there was a civil war, and then there was a civil rights movement. And not a whole lot else happened in America over the last.
The rest was just filler. It was just
the rest
filler,
was exactly. Yeah. It's just a bunch of footnotes, and we can pretty much skip over and refer to it under the general category of back in the day.
Right.
But in reality, when an immigrant comes to America, an immigrant asks a whole set of different questions about America that have to go to the heart of American exceptionalism. Why do Americans do things this way, whereas the rest of the world does things that way? And we're less interested in actually how wealth got distributed. I'm much more interested, as most immigrants are, in how wealth gets created. How does a country go from being an economic backwater, which America was in the beginning of the 19th century, to being the richest society in the world? How is it that we've created a society where there's so much abundance for the ordinary guy? Progressivism conceals these questions because it wants to focus simply on the people left out. But I think more important than the issue of who gets left out is how was the system, the engine of prosperity, wealth, the pursuit of happiness, how was that created to then enable you to let everybody else in?
Right, and I think a lot of people get hung up, at least the people on the left, when they're attacking people from the right, is they get hung up on this idea that we hate all immigrants and that we want to throw Mexican babies over the border and things like that. That none of us have that actual opinion. We think that, or at least I do. I think that immigrants have a lot to provide, but they do have to come through a legal means and all of those things. They have to jump through a set of hoops, and they also have to want to be a part of the American experience, which is different from wherever they came from. I mean, it's going to be no matter where they came from, it's going to be different from there because the American dream and the American way, let's call it the American way, it just functions different than every other country.
I mean, I'm an immigrant from India. I'm a person of color, as they say. I've been in the conservative precincts since at least the Reagan years, and I've never met people on the right who hold the views that the left ascribes to the right.
Right.
So this is a bogeyman that is of their own myth making. It's a very important myth for them. Why? Because, and this is, by the way, why they keep using the term illegal immigrant. First of all, illegals are not immigrants. An immigrant is someone who actually comes the legal way. And an illegal immigrant is an insult to legal immigrants like me. Why? Because I know there are people in India standing in a very long line. They'd love to come here, but they're being upstaged by some guy who jumps across the fence or swims across the Rio Grande. So that's called cutting the line. And
Right.
it's not just a violation of the rights of the native-born American. It's a violation of the rights of all the other people who are standing in that line. So the left does this very deliberately to foment a kind of anxiety among legal Hispanics and say to them, hey, look, Trump doesn't like Mexicans. Hey, look, Trump doesn't like immigrants. It's a fairly choreographed and deliberate lie, and their vocabulary is what gives it away. He's an undocumented immigrant.
Undocumented.
Is someone who comes and forcibly takes over my house an undocumented owner? Really?
Yeah, he just misplaced the deed to the house that you're living in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The problem is not the occupation; it's just the lack of documentation.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the other thing that the other reason that they would do that, why they would set up that lie of that all Republicans are all conservatives. I really think we need a new moniker. I don't like either one of those things, but they want to set up this idea that they have some moral high ground, that they are the moral superior, and that we are the moral inferior because we want things done legally. If you just say it in those terms, then they don't really have a moral high ground because you're standing on the law. But if they can say they just don't like these people, it has nothing to do with the law or anything like that. They just don't like Mexicans, or they just don't like black people, or they just don't like that. If they can frame you in that light, they can jump and take the moral high ground, and it's a very, very solid tactic.
So the reason that it works, I mean, the brazen hypocrisy of it, the preposterous double standards couldn't be more obvious. So how do they get away with it? Why do they make even you and me spend our time explaining that, hey, listen, we're not racist, and hey, we want to live by the law? Why do we even have to do this? It's almost like if someone were to look outside and it's obviously a clear sunny day and they keep saying it's raining, and then you and I have to spend our time explaining that it isn't raining.
Right.
So why do we do this? The reason we do this is because they control the megaphones of our culture.
Right.
The networks, the New York Times, they have a kind of virtual monopoly of mainstream media. And so as a result, they can put out huge big lies. The same is true, by the way, of academia. They can put out massive big lies, suppress vital information that is critical to your understanding of a subject, and yet they will leave it out. One little tidbit from my book. So Woodrow Wilson, we know a lot about Woodrow Wilson. One thing we don't know about Woodrow Wilson is that Woodrow Wilson opposed the automobile. Woodrow Wilson did not think there should be cars. He was against cars. It's not just that he didn't want to drive a car. He didn't think cars should exist, right? Yeah. Now, this little fact, which runs so counter to the idea of Wilson's self-portrait. He's a visionary. He's a progressive. He can see the future. Nothing could be further from the truth. And so what do progressive biographers do? They take this incriminating little detail and they leave it out of every Woodrow Wilson biography. They don't let it go up on Wikipedia. It's not on the History Channel. So the bottom line of it is young people never get to see, wow, this great visionary, this great progressive, the first progressive president of America, oppose the automobile. And in fact, sounds a lot like people today who say the same thing about new innovations. When we hear people say things about fracking, they use exactly the same language that Wilson used about the car. And it's ultimately an argument I call it an argument from personal incredulity, because he thinks that the reason we shouldn't have cars is he personally, sitting in his office at Princeton, can't think of a good reason why anyone would want a car.
Right.
The horse and buggy should surely be good enough. And today we hear the same thing. I, sitting in my office at the New York Times, can't think of why we need fracking. Why do we need to have all this complicated technology going to the ground? I can't think of a reason for it. Therefore, there must not be a reason.
Yeah, so that brings up a really good point. Something that I was thinking about as I was reading your book there. I was thinking about my own education. And I was thinking back to how I learned about things when I was, in elementary school and middle school and high school, and then thinking about what I'm seeing now. I've got 4 children, and 2 of them are in regular school, and I'm just trying to think of, what did I get taught then that it was not complete? I know I learned about Edison. I think Edison is another test case of how someone's legacy has changed over the years. If you see what they teach about Edison now, he's the bad guy. He's the bad guy. The immigrant, Tesla, is the hero. Now that might be true. History might not be as kind to Edison as it used to be, but how those stories change is a very interesting phenomenon to me. That history can change by the left rewriting it.
Absolutely true. And the progressives who write history have, you can fairly say, almost no understanding of the entrepreneurial mindset. And this is partly why they don't get Trump. It isn't just that Trump is Republican, he's conservative. It's also that his entrepreneurial mindset is utterly alien to them. There was an episode early in Trump's career where he and this time Marla Maples were walking down the street. They see this beggar. And Marla goes, "Oh, I feel sorry for him." And Trump gives him some money. And she goes, "Oh, isn't it terrible?" And Trump goes, "You know that guy? He's richer than me." And she goes, "What?" And Trump goes, "Yeah, Trump is $900 million in debt." So he goes, "This
Right.
guy's $900 million richer than me." But the idea that an entrepreneur can be cavalier about that, have the chutzpah to admit it, still give the guy some money and see a way out of it.
Right.
Whereas the ordinary liberal would be going into therapy, he'd be doing incredible navel gazing, he'd consider his life to be a waste, he'd go to self-esteem seminars where people would tell him that he's not the loser that he's actually decided that he is. So that's basically the progressive path out of this. And then there's Trump's path, which is go build a new building, let's go start a new show, go figure out a way to create some value somewhere in which you can actually recover your losses and come out on top.
I always think that this quote from him it's a great quote. It was back during the campaign. I believe he was meeting with some religious people. Like I think it was some congregation. It was sort of one of those tests that all of the Republicans have to go through. They have to sit down in front of this crowd of Christians and then get asked questions. And I believe the question was, do you ever apologize, or are you ever what was the actual word? It was basically, do you ever apologize for anything you do? And he says, well, I do things wrong from time to time, but I don't really think about it. I move on. I move in a different direction. So if I do something wrong, I don't sit and beat myself up about it. I move on to the next direction, and change my path. And I always thought that was a great answer, because that was not the answer they were looking for. They were looking for, every night I confess my sins to God and make myself right and all of those things. Yeah, it was, do you repent? Somebody said it in the comments. Do you repent? And he said that I don't think about it in those terms. I move on, and if I do something wrong, I'm going to do something else. I thought that was just an amazing thing especially in front of the crowd that he was in front of, and he got a standing ovation for it, because all of the other candidates did exactly what they were supposed to do, and he didn't.
Yeah, he's not only, he's the classic embodiment of the anti-socialist mindset, because he's the classic entrepreneur, but he's also the political leader of the fight against socialism. And I think of Trump more as a wartime general. And what I mean by that is that Lincoln realized in the early 1860s that you couldn't have politics as usual, because Washington, D.C. had been gangsterized by the Democrats. You had to start doing to them what they were doing to him. And so Lincoln became very tough. And that's ultimately how he got Grant. I'm amazed how in the Republican Party today, we have the equivalent of people running to Lincoln and saying something, we can't have Grant because, Grant was an alcoholic, and Grant, ran his father's business into the ground, and, Grant uses foul language. And Lincoln, of course, was like, yeah, but can he fight? That's really the relevant question here. We can take up all the other questions later. But this is the pressing question at hand. So that's the thing about Trump, is he knows how to fight, and a little bit of him even relishes it.
Yeah, I think he does.
Yeah,
I think a lot bit of him relishes the fight. I think he likes the fight.
He likes to fight, but I'll tell you something. I was my family had a kind of one-on-one with him. It's late last year. We got a lot of time. Trump was sort of let his hair down, and my wife asked him. She said, Mr. President, I don't know how you take it. I mean, you get slammed on every platform, every second of every day. I mean, a normal person would go under the table and never come out. How do you do it? And we expected Trump to go, ha, 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 I love it and stuff. And, but he thought about it and he goes, well, guys, he goes, I got to admit, it does get to me. He goes,
Right.
At the end of the day, he goes, I'm knocking myself out to make things better. And at the end of the day, the fact that these people continue to straight out lie. And by the way, this was right before impeachment because it was late last year. And Trump said, I'm very lucky that in this impeachment business, I have a tape. He goes, because if I didn't have a tape, people from my own administration would go out there and have brazen lies about, I said this on the call, I said that on the call, I promised them this, I offered them a suitcase of cash. Completely made up fabrications. And Trump said, even then, I'm going to be saved by the fact that we have a tape. And so what I actually said is on the record. And so I found it a quite eye-opening close-up look at Trump, a little different from, let's say, Trump's persona on Twitter. But by the way, that's true of a lot of us. My persona on Twitter is a little different than my real personality also.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I'm pretty close. I think I'm pretty close to who I am on Twitter, but I think everybody plays a little bit of a role. That's really interesting about how he answered that. I've always gotten the feeling that that this does get to him eventually. Like I can't imagine that it wouldn't. And I've tried to explain this to people, and I really think that if people could understand it, that they would understand Trump a lot more than they do. Just how deep all of this hurt goes. I mean, he is the most attacked person on the planet and has been for the last 4 years. There's nobody that gets more attacks daily than he does, and the media will say, "Oh, he's freaking out," or he's falling apart. There's the White House is about to collapse. All of those things. But I don't know of anyone that could have handled the amount of things that he's handled in the graceful way that, like, it's sort of funny to say that Trump handles things gracefully, but given the circumstances, he handles them very gracefully, like more than I could imagine anyone else doing. And I just wish people could understand that. I met him as well, and when we were in the Oval, there was nothing else in the world going on. He'd just gotten back from North Korea, literally gotten back from North Korea the day before, but there was nothing else in the world going on when we were in that room. And that's something that's just an amazing feat for him to pull off.
I think what makes it striking for Trump is that, remember that there was a time when he was lionized by these same people.
Right.
And so a certain part of him must go, wow, what changed? I'm still Trump. I say the same things now that I did in the 80s. If you listen to interviews from Trump, it's almost eerily similar.
Oh, yes.
As to what he says. So it's not as if Trump has changed. So how did he suddenly undergo this kind of public metamorphosis from being the darling of the left to suddenly becoming, a Lucifer? How did that happen? I think Trump's probably wondering that.
I think we're all wondering that, actually.
Yeah. When I had my kind of campaign finance case, once I saw the left up close, I mean, my own views became a little bit radicalized because I began to realize that, what, my kind of civics book idea of American politics, we've got sort of two sides where, they believe this, we believe that. It's kind of a great debate that we then place before the American people. That is actually not all that is going on here. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of things happening under the surface. And these people have become like the Democrats of the 1850s. When Preston Brooks took a cane and went to Charles Sumner, Republican senator's office, and beat him, almost within an inch of his life. And that's what these people would do to us if they had the chance.
Well, and I think that's exactly right. That I think we do, at least I do. I think I have this vision in my head of what a public debate looks like, and the left versus the right. It's not it's not a fight to the death. It's two people with different ideas, but in reality, that isn't what it is. It's people unfriending you from Facebook. It's people cutting you off in real life and saying, no, I can't associate with you. It's your former friends and neighbors sending you texts saying you can't come to the barbecue. It's gone out away from just some sort of public discourse to really just a pure hatred of anyone that disagrees with you.
And I think it manifests itself most simply in the politics of exclusion. You take someone like Rachel Maddow. Dinesh, wrote a book comparing Democrats to Nazis. Now, this is a complete caricature of one of my earlier books.
Right.
So you think she would have the confidence of saying, well, if I'm speaking the truth, I should have Dinesh on just 3 minutes and let's discuss why he would say this. Now, she can't take that risk. Because if she puts me on for 90 seconds, I would unfurl so many incriminating and damning facts that she would be completely unable to answer, that she would be destroyed on her own show. Even though she controls the mic and controls the show, she cannot take that risk, so she'll never do it. So ultimately, the public is being subjected to a massive deception because they kind of feel like information is being put out there, but the truth of it is none of it is being subjected to critical scrutiny. There's no juxtaposing of points of view, so you can actually weigh and see who's actually right, who's telling the truth, who has the weight of the argument. This kind of thing, which, by the way, we had in the 80s. Even CNN had a show called Crossfire, but that kind of thing has largely vanished from American public discourse, and it's obviously not a good thing.
No, and I think also exactly what you're saying there is part of what has made the coronavirus such a bad time here is that the news is not always just lies. It's omission, it's lack of context, and during the corona outbreak here, the biggest thing that I saw was death totals. Death totals without any sort of context for them. How is this a normal death total for a virus of this type? Where are these concentrated? What's happening? Like they just throw that number out there because it's scary. They throw the number out there and then they keep making it tick up, and the lack of context in media and the unwillingness for them to bring someone like you onto a show to defend yourself, they are much more willing to go fight their version of you, but never actually you. They're always fighting this dummy that just is wearing your face.
Exactly. And you have the worst kinds of data manipulation going on, which has, let's just say, 2 coronavirus cases, and it goes up to 3. And you have a liberal county, let's say, which has 800 cases, and it goes up to 1,200. The left will say that the rate of increase in the conservative county was greater because going from 2 to 3 is a 50% increase.
Right.
Whereas the other is only a 40% increase. So this is the kind of way in which you do jugglery. And it's transparent. Anyone with the simplest understanding of facts can see you are massaging the data in the most specious way.
Right.
But they do it anyway. Because I think they basically think that although we can't fool all the people all the time, maybe we can fool most of the people most of the time, and that's good enough.
Right, and I think that also goes back to what we were talking about earlier about just schools and how they manipulate the history. Is that if we can fool enough people here, we can create one generation, and then the next generation we can fool them a little bit more, and the next generation we can fool them a little bit more, until they'll be fooled by anything. And I think we're reaching sort of a point. I don't know if it's the tipping point yet, but it sort of feels like it, of that people are not able to even really think for themselves anymore, at least a portion of them.
I think that this socialist temptation, if I can call it that, it really runs through everybody, right? So the Democrats count on, I would call it, the worst angels of our nature. They're saying to people today, listen, by the way, you've been at home, you haven't had to shave, you haven't had to get dressed, you haven't had to punch a time clock, you don't have some manager telling you what to do. Hasn't it been really nice to sit on your couch and do absolutely nothing, play in your yard, have time with your family? So why don't you go for this idea of universal basic income? We'll try to keep sending you, $2,000 a month, and you can be a slug for the rest of your life. Now, there's a little part of everybody that says,
Yeah, well, all right.
not entirely a bad idea. But then I think that the other side of human nature says, you know what? There's a certain earned gratification when I accomplish something, even if, I put the hoop in the basket. Wow, I just have that great feeling. I solved the problem. I got it done. That sense of earned accomplishment, not bogus self-esteem, but rather earned self-esteem. We're hoping that side of human nature ultimately triumphs, and that will be, if that's strong enough in America, we will never get to the United States of socialism.
Well, and I hope that we don't. I know we're gonna have to go here shortly. Something also that I was thinking about as I was reading, and this is sort of something that I always think about when I hear about socialism or think about socialism, is that ideal of Star Trek, the Next Generation, that society where they're free to go explore, and I feel like that's sort of when you talk about the temptation of socialism, I think that's the ideal that people are thinking of, is we'll build these great ships, we'll explore the galaxy, everyone will have their best career, a career that makes them happy, and they don't have to worry about wealth, and that's really the ideal that I think tempts people into saying, well, sure, it's been really nice to be at home, and maybe I should just stay at home forever, and you guys should just pay me.
Exactly. And the left thinks that this socialist dream, if you will, is realized in countries like Norway and Sweden. Now, in reality, that's not the case. The Scandinavian societies are actually very capitalist in wealth creation, even if they are more socialist, and they are, in wealth distribution. So the Scandinavians do not kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. They have low corporate tax rates, in some cases lower than here. They have no minimum wage. Companies can hire and fire for any reason. They have no wealth tax, with one exception, no inheritance tax. Finland tried universal basic income, got rid of it. So the Scandinavians, in that sense, do not demonize the rich. They create the wealth first.
Right.
And then when they distribute it, then they do have a generous welfare state on a number of fronts. But their point is, we're all in this together, so everyone has to pay. So even if you make 60 or 70 grand, you still pay a 50% tax rate. They do not hesitate to tax the middle class, and they impose the VAT tax, which is the value-added tax, which is a consumption tax that falls disproportionately on the poor. So far from this whole demonize the rich, don't worry, billionaires will pay for it all, the Scandinavian motto is, we're going to soak the whole society. You're going to get some healthcare, but it's not free. Don't even use that term, because somebody is paying for it. And guess who that is? You are.
Well, and I think we should end on this, is I was always taught growing up that if someone tells you something is free, it's not free. It's never free. There's never something for free. Somebody is always paying for it, and I think that's lost on a lot of people in my generation, but also in the next generation here, is that you can actually get something for free. It always takes hard work. You work hard. I do have a question for you though as well. I know that somebody asked me earlier, are you planning on doing any more movies? Or do you have anything in the works?
Oh, for sure. I've been in the documentary film business, and I've just completed film number 5. Typically, when I write a book, it becomes the spine, the kind of intellectual storyline of a movie. And we've just completed a terrific film, which we're about to release later this summer. We're just watching carefully to see the situation with the theaters, because some of the theaters aren't even open. In others, they are open, but with limited seating. So we're following the big studios. I mean, Disney is going to release Mulan, and there's Tenet. There are big movies coming out, and we would come out in that same cluster, but we've got to make sure the conditions are right. So yes, we'll have a big movie. It's going to get out one way or the other, and we're watching carefully to see how and when.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for showing up and for talking with me for a while. It's been fun. I'm really glad you came on the show. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
All right. So thank you guys for watching, and we will have an episode next week. I'm not sure who the guest will be, but there will be a guest, so we will get that figured out. And as soon as I know, I will let you guys know. So thank you guys for watching, and have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank
Welcome to Carpe's Corner, so happy that you're here. So take a seat, have a tea, or grab yourself a beer. Here at Carpe's Corner, we'll learn about our lives. And in between, you might decide to exercise your rights. It's Carpe's Corner. Carpe's Corner, don't forget reviews. Comment, like, and subscribe is all you gotta do. Here at Carpe's Corner, please appreciate our guests. And just remember, everyone's got something on their chest. In Carpe's Corner.
All right. I have one more thing. One more thing for anybody that's left on here. I have added a new platform that I'm streaming from. It is called Clouthub. So let me tell you all the places I'm streaming currently. I am streaming on YouTube, Twitch, DLive, Facebook, and Periscope, and now Clouthub. So you can go to www.clouthub.com/CarpeDonktum, and I've got a whole channel right there that you can go to. So I will see you guys later. Check out all my social media, and thanks guys for watching.